Welcome to the second video on the history of vampires from the tabletop role-playing game Vampire the Masquerade. Some of my fellow lore monkeys and students of the game will probably say, what about this obscure event in 1666? Well, my answer is, my goal is to keep this video moving and round about an hour. Let's see if I succeed. Enough preamble, let's conclude the history of vampires. The first La Sombra reached Hispaniola and Cuba to make their havens and claim domain over the New World, though they were far from the first vampires to reach the Americas. The native people of Aztlan had their own vampires, grown fat on blood and sacrifice. How these three Aztec Methuselahs reached the Americas remains a topic of speculation, but the La Sombra quickly realized that they were no match for the blood gods Huitzilopochtli, Tezcatlipoca, and Tlaloc. Aside from the La Sombra, another vampire made her presence felt, if not known, early in the age of exploration. The Toreador Methuselah Helena reached Hispaniola sometime in the early 16th century in pursuit of her ancient enemy, the Bruja Menelai, who had traveled to South America over a century before and hid himself among the Incans. Helena quietly financed Hernan Cortez's 1519 expedition to explore and colonize New Spain, hoping to uncover and finally destroy Menelai. By 1519, the La Sombra, who were unaware of Helena's influence on events, brought in outside Sabbat from Spain to do their heavy lifting for them: Tzimisce, Bruja, and Nosferatu Antitribu. This first war pack of the New World called itself Negrum Triste, the Black Sorrow. The Negrum Triste joined with Hernan Cortez's conquistadors, who already had the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan under siege in 1521. When the conquistadors entered the city, the Sabbat sent war ghouls in first to burn down the temple of Huitzilopochtli. Tlaloc meanwhile escaped into Lake Texcoco. Letters sent back from New Spain to Cuba claimed that the Negrum Triste unearthed the titanic corpse of Huitzilopochtli and diablerized it, a process that took 4 nights. Then the hunt began for Tezcatlipoca, but the Negrum Triste were never heard from again, as something hunted and slaughtered them down to the last Cainite. Later events would call into question the Negrum Triste's claim to have destroyed Huitzilopochtli. Helena left Tenochtitlan in great haste for Cartagena, abandoning one of her children in the city, Melinda Galbraith. Menelai managed to flee the Incan Empire before its conquest by Francisco Pizarro in 1532. He subsequently hid himself among the native peoples of the Southwest and Midwest North America, who gave him the name Pale Wolf. Back in Europe in 1529, Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, laid siege to Vienna following the death of Louis II, King of Hungary. Included in the Sultan's forces were vampires from Clan Tzimisce and Clan Assamite. The Assamite sorcerers were eager to break the Tremere curse by burning down the Vienna chantry and slaying every warlock they could find. But in the end, the siege failed. Despite sending numerous Tremere to their deaths, the great chantry remained when the Turkish forces withdrew. Back in the New World, Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River and discovered an island he named Mont Royal. Also aboard his ship, the Emerillon, was a French gangrel anti-tribu named Louis Drapeau, the first Sabbat scout in Canada, who noted that the island would make an excellent stronghold for the Sabbat, far away from the Camarillais power base. Samuel de Champlain arrived 70 years later to establish a settlement on the island. On May 17, 1642, the Ville Marie was founded. The mission was accompanied by French La Sombra and gangrel anti-tribu, disguised as Jesuit missionaries and colonists. Louis Drapeau, who remained in New France, met his fellow Sabbat and gave them the lay of the land. These Cainites would go to form the first Sabbat coven of the New World under Drapeau's leadership, Les Acadiens. The coven was nearly wiped out in 1643 by the Iroquois, but Les Acadiens would recover under its lone survivor, the Tzimisce Conat. Indeed, they would be joined by 3 new covens in time: the bloodthirsty Le Capot Bleu, the Blue Hoods, Les Miserables, the Vile Ones, and the Shepherds of Cain, the keepers of the Litany of Blood, the official history of the Sabbat. And yet more Sabbat made their way to the New World by way of Spain, though for different ports. In 1661, Ekaterina the Wise, the agitator of Prague, arrived in New Amsterdam, becoming the first, if unofficial, Sabbat bishop of the lonely little colony that would eventually transform into New York. In 1673, the Dutch attempted to retake New Amsterdam from the English. Carried with them in their cargo were Sabbat vampires, including members of the Black Hand, who targeted and eliminated aspiring Prince of New York, the toreador Bernard Hine. Sometime in the early portion of the 18th century, the French ventrue Duran, child of Gaius Marcellus, traveled to the Louisiana Territory, spurred by his sire's journals and notes, with a dream of creating a new Carthage in the New World. However, in 1713, Duran was attacked by Simón de Cosa, a Spanish bourgeois. This would be the first skirmish in a century-long war between the two for the control of Louisiana. In 1716, Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne, governor of the Louisiana Territory and ghoul of Duran, defeated de Cosa's native allies, the Natchez. 2 years later, in 1718, the city of New Orleans was founded by Le Moyne under a charter from the French Mississippi Company. In one of the little ironies of vampire history, Duran tried on several occasions to plead his case to de Cosa, to share with him in his vision for an American Carthage, only to be rebuffed. Anyway, Le Moyne was defeated in 1736 by the Chickasaws, but de Cosa and his new allies were unable to sack the city of New Orleans or unseat Duran. 19 years later, in 1755, the Cajuns arrived in Louisiana, and with them, several werewolves and kin from the Black Spiral Dancers tribe. Duran signed a treaty with the native Uktena to defend the territory against the newcomers, as much as it disgusted the Lupines to do so. In 1761, Gorkist, the Zamitzi regent of the Sabbat, appointed Francisco Domingo de Polonia, a La Sombra mercenary and rising star of the Amici Noctis, as Archbishop of New York, much to the consternation of Ekaterina, who had been in the city from nearly its beginning, and resented having the newcomer Polonia elevated above her. But Polonia was viewed as much more politically reliable than Ekaterina, and the upper echelons of the Sabbat still remained very much controlled by the La Sombra and Zamitzi, with the anti-tribu still considered junior partners at best. Returning to mortal affairs, by 1767, Spain, under the rule of King Charles, instituted administrative and military reforms aimed at exerting crown rule over colonial independence. One of these measures was the expulsion of the Jesuits from all of Spain's territories and the confiscation of their assets by a secret letter sent to all of the provincial viceroys and governors, to be carried out on April 2nd of that same year. The La Sombra were caught off guard when their power base in Spain and the New World was effectively cut out from under them. The Jesuits were herded en masse onto ships bound for Italy. Within the Sabbat, the La Sombra outright accused the Zamitzi of plotting against them and even colluding with the Camarilla. The Zamitzi were outraged at having their honor impugned in this way and declared war on the La Sombra. This was to be the first of 3 civil wars that would threaten to collapse the Sabbat from within. Back in Louisiana, Simón de Cosa overplayed his hand in an attempt to cut off Duran's commercial influence and outside aid. All non-Spanish imports to the city were placed under interdiction, a move that was financially ruinous for the territory. But Don Luis de Unzaga, the 4th Spanish governor of Louisiana, a career soldier and administrator, and by 1770, the son-in-law of Gilbert Antoine de Saint-Masson, the wealthiest man in the Louisiana Territory, was open to a mutually beneficial arrangement with Duran. New Orleans was dying, and the English had goods for sale, and Duran owned enough wharves, warehouses, and teamsters to bring them in quietly. By 1778, half of the goods in New Orleans had been smuggled in from English ports, and Duran was a very wealthy ventrue. De Cosa decided to settle matters with him once and for all. His ghouls went to burn down Duran's haven in what is today the French Quarter, but Duran had long since secretly retreated to a more secure manor in the bayou. The Great Fire of 1788 burned down approximately 80% of the city of New Orleans. DeCosa was universally condemned by the kindred of Louisiana for his recklessness. However, Duran was unable to capitalize on this blunder. In 1790, he was summoned to France to help his sire, Gaius, escape from the madness of the French Revolution and the anarchs stalking the streets of Paris. But word of the fire got back to Spain, and DeCosa's European allies began to regard him as a loose cannon and a liability. When Louisiana was returned to French control in 1801, DeCosa fled to the swamps, leaving Duran to claim the title Prince of New Orleans. And on the topic of new administrations, the relatively new United States of America had its first session of Congress in the new federal capital of Washington, D.C. on November 17, 1800. At the same time, a Bruja named Arthur Carroll proclaimed himself Prince of Georgetown, Maryland, and the federal capital. For the most part, his proclamation was ignored, as other Camarilla vampires preferred to fight over the better established and more commercial-rich ports of Annapolis, Boston, Philadelphia, and Richmond. 3 years later, in 1803, the First Sabbat Civil War came to a close, with the signing of the Purchase Pact on September 13th under the authority of Regent Gorkist. The pact forbade open conflict between members of the Sabbat on pain of final death. Additionally, Gorkist, after consultation with his consistory, moved the center of Sabbat operations from Europe to Mexico City. The Archbishop of Mexico City, Melinda Galbraith, was subsequently honored with a seat in the consistory. That same year, France sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million. Prince Duran's carefully cultivated French administrators were suddenly replaced with rough-hewn, freshly minted Americans under Governor William Claiborne. With the Americans came mages, who frustrated Duran's attempts to control the new government. Then, in 1814, Duran met his first mage, when he was suddenly and unexpectedly invited to a party thrown by the governor. The mage's representative, Esau Grimes, a member of the Cult of Ecstasy, introduced himself to Duran, and after appropriate small talk, made a proposal. The War of 1812 between the United States and Britain was, in part, a struggle between mages, one group known as the Traditions, and the other, the Order of Reason. If Duran would smuggle weapons into American hands, the mages of New Orleans would cede political and cultural control of the city to him. After considering the offer for a few months, Duran agreed in early December, on the condition that one of his agents, the infamous French privateer Jean Lafitte, be released from American custody to bring up cannons from his smuggling port at Barataria Bay. On January 8, 1815, forces of the United States Army met British regulars under the command of Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, 5 miles south of the city of New Orleans. The American forces, with the support of mages, privateers, and a few ghouls, routed the British and technocratic forces in a scant 30 minutes at the Battle of New Orleans. The victory, despite technically being won after the war's end, propelled the commanding officer, General Andrew Jackson, into the national spotlight, for better or worse. Back in Mexico City, with peace restored to the Sabbat, they could finally turn to the task of expelling the Camarilla from Mexico City. By 1821, the Camarilla had written off Mexico as a lost cause and left the Toreador prince Parian to whatever her fate would be. But Parian would not go down without a fight. She hired Assamite assassins and Nosferatu mercenaries to ambush Sabbat war packs that were hunting her. But after 2 months of fighting, Parian's resources and allies were exhausted, while the Sabbat closed in on her. Parian, the last prince of Mexico City, faced her death with quiet, regal dignity as the Sabbat drained her of her blood. Her skin was taken as a trophy by the Tzimisce and has been displayed at annual blood feasts commemorating the fall of Mexico City to the Sabbat. On Christmas Day, 1828, the first vampire of California arrived, or rather, crashed, in San Pedro Bay. The 200-year-old Toreador, Christopher Horton, whose ship, the Danube, had been caught in a storm and sank to the bottom of the bay, was recovered by the servants of hacienda owner Don Sebastian Juan Dominguez. In 1832, Helena and Menelaus finally met in person for the first time in nearly 2 millennia, outside of Fort Dearborn in the Illinois Territory. In the midst of a battle between the U.S. Army and the Blackhawks, the Methuselahs fought hand-to-hand in their feud that began with the fall of Carthage, but neither was able to land a killing blow, and both were driven into torpor from their wounds. Their followers carried them back to safety, Helena to Fort Dearborn, and Menelaus back into the wilderness. A year later, on August 12, 1833, 200 people near the fort organized the town of Chicago. 4 years later, in 1837, Chicago had its first prince, a bourgeois trader by the name of Maxwell, a child of the ancient Promethean Altamira, and an ally of the torpid, but still very aware, Menelaus. Meanwhile, another prince, the Scottish ventru Kyle Strathcona, ruler of Montreal, used the cover of the Lower Canada rebellions to exterminate the Camarilla elements in his own city, and then pledged his allegiance to the Sabbat. With the backing of the Shepherds of Cain, Strathcona was recognized as Archbishop. This turn of events was a source of great embarrassment to Clan Ventru, and Mithras in particular, who had regarded Strathcona as politically powerless and expendable. But not everything in the New World was a success for the Sabbat. Regent Gorkist, who had guided his sect through civil war and unrest, and held it together through sheer force of will, was assassinated on the first week of June 1863 by a deranged Ravnos anti-tribu. With his death, old wounds from the First Civil War reopened, as French invaders closed in on Mexico City. Once again, accusations of betrayal and incompetence flew fast and loose, until the La Sombra and Zamitzi were at each other's throats. Several archbishops and cardinals laid claim to the fallen Gorkist regency, resulting in a second Sabbat civil war. And back in the United States, the Americans were in the grip of their own civil war between the Union and the Confederacy. The bourgeois prince of Georgetown and Washington, D.C., Arthur Carroll, met final death at the hands of an Assamite assassin, allegedly hired by James Harrison, a Ventru elder of Richmond, Virginia, and Confederate sympathizer. But Carroll's death cleared the path for the Tremere Pontifex of D.C., Marissa, to seize power as other vampires cowered in their havens. She allied with the Nosferatu and Malkavians of the city, who she granted privileges and rights they had been denied under Carroll. By the end of the war in 1865, Marissa's power base, combined with the boons owed to her by the defeated southern lords, who had been allowed to keep their domains, solidified her rule over the district. Her Tremere superiors attempted to replace her as Pontifex, but a combination of her replacement being lost at sea and Sabbat pacts from New York probing D.C. for weaknesses put an end to any talk of unseating Marissa, either as Pontifex or Prince. Returning to California, Christopher Horton, freed from his sire's rule, had indulged in a stream of debauchery and excess in California. But after 42 years of wanton indulgence, the Toreador decided that he was wasting his resources and time, and that he ought to turn Los Angeles into a city appreciative of misunderstood artistes like himself. On Christmas Day, 1870, Christopher embraced his long-time and long-suffering ghoul, Don Sebastian, and named him Prince of Los Angeles. The two spent the next 40 years cleaning up the rough, lawless town, encouraging commerce, art, and settlement in the valley, and strong-armed a few independent towns into joining Los Angeles County. On October 8, 1871, the Great Chicago Fire, set by a Malkavian under the thrall of Helena, burned down 18,000 buildings and destroyed most of Prince Maxwell's vampire supporters. Maxwell himself was attacked by a relative newcomer to his domain, the Ventru Loden, who was also an unwitting pawn of Helena. Maxwell escaped Loden and fled the city. Before the ashes even cooled, Loden proclaimed himself Prince of Chicago. He then hunted down every other Ventru in the city and slew them, as he would suffer no challengers from within his own clan. But Loden's first challenger was a Toreador named Modius, who was prince of the Union-dominated city of Gary, Indiana. Loden's first instinct was to crush Modius's labor supporters outright with police and judicial power. Following the disastrous Pullman strike of 1894, Loden decided to change tacks and co-opt the labor movement from within. His first agent in this was the socialist leader Tommy Hines, who brought the strikes to an end. However, Modius continued to oppose Loden until 1908, when Hines secretly converted Modius's lieutenant and anarch enforcer, Balthazar, to switch over to the winning team. Balthazar betrayed Modius's haven and his own sire to Loden's agents. Modius escaped to Gary. Loden then placed that city under economic interdiction that ruined the once prosperous steel town. A year later, in 1909, Christopher Horton turned his attention away from the civil development of Los Angeles towards a new form of media where he could finally express his artistic vision: film. Christopher bribed and dominated early directors to shoot their pictures in California, and funneled his own personal wealth into setting up the studio system, which he micromanaged right down to the final cuts. Further to the south, sometime around 1920, Archbishop Galbraith, child of Helena and senior member of Gorky's consistory, summoned envoys from the Sabbat domains in Eastern Europe, Italy, Spain, Canada, and the United States to a meeting in Mexico City. The Sabbat had been bled by nearly 50 years of civil war and had allowed the Camarilla to seize territory from them in the United States and Europe. Galbraith declared herself regent of the Sabbat and informed the envoys that she would enforce both the Purchase Pact and the Code of Milan without mercy. This threat was backed up by 3 of the 4 seraphs of the Black Hand: Jalanajab, Izim Urbal, and Elimelech the Twice Damned. Secretly, Galbraith had another, more powerful supporter, the supposedly dead Aztec Methuselah Huitzilopochtli, or, as he was known to his Bali progeny, Shaitan. And from Black Hands to Black Friday, the great stock market crash of 1929. The Ventru Michaela of Pennsylvania saw an opportunity and traveled from her home to Manhattan. By the time the United States emerged from the Great Depression, Michaela was a billionaire, once all of the depreciated assets she had bought up recovered. But her newfound fortune came at a price, as she and her wealth were an island surrounded by a sea of angry Sabbat. Near the end of the Second World War, the Scottish Anarch Jeremy McNeill arrived in Los Angeles after having been driven out of New England by the Ventru. However, his reputation as a troublemaker preceded him, and Don Sebastian wanted McNeill out of Los Angeles as quickly as he had arrived. Christopher Horton ordered Don Sebastian not to touch him. Christopher was infatuated with the charismatic rebel, but feared rejection and scorn, and refused to reveal his existence to McNeill. Don Sebastian regarded McNeill as a threat, not only to his own power, but for his sire's affection. By 1944, the situation had reached a breaking point. While Christopher was away in Sacramento to dominate the state's legislature, Don Sebastian had McNeill seized and brought to his hacienda. Once there, the prince dominated McNeill into bashing his own skull into bloody ruin, for the amusement of his court. After the Don had tired of this, he had McNeill stripped naked and tossed out into the street with a warning that if he survived the day, he was to be gone from Los Angeles by the next night. McNeill concealed himself from the sun by hiding in a dumpster. When night fell, he limped to the haven of his friend and fellow anarch, Salvador Garcia. In subsequent tellings of the tale, McNeill was seized and beaten by the Don's minions and ghouls. The anarchs of Los Angeles howled for retaliation, but the leaders argued for patience and preparation. For several weeks, the anarchs reconnoitered the havens of the elders and primogen of the city, and on December 21, 1944, just a few hours before dawn, the anarchs attacked, ambushing elder vampires as they returned to their havens. Not every assassination attempt was successful, but enough were to demoralize the Camarilla. When the Anarch war party led by Salvador Garcia reached Don Sebastian's hacienda, they found the place torn apart, along with its inhabitants, ghouls and vampires alike. A lone Malkavian survivor babbled something about a demon with golden hair, as Garcia discovered the Don's fate. The attacker had ripped Sebastian's body apart in a bathroom and, as a final insult, tore his head from his body and dropped it in a wastebasket. Of course, this story would not do for Anarch propaganda. The official version of the story, approved by McNeil and Garcia, was that Garcia had fought Don Sebastian in single combat and, despite being overmatched in age and blood, got the better of the prince and valiantly slew him. The next night, on December 22nd, Jeremy McNeil and the hastily formed Revolutionary Council declared the creation of the Anarch Free States. San Diego, San Jose, and Fresno soon followed suit as princes were deposed and killed, and freedom was proclaimed. But the Anarchs' northern march was halted at San Francisco by the united forces of that city's prince, the Ventru Vannevar Thomas. By February of 1945, the Anarch Free States consisted of most of California, from San Jose down to the Mexican border. The Anarchs held their breath and waited for the Camarillas' counterattack, which never came. The simple reason was that the European Camarilla were too busy trying to save their own skins to be bothered with matters in the United States, and the American Camarilla were too isolated and disconnected to mount any sort of combined campaign to retake California. But speaking of utopian aspirations, we return to Prince Duran of New Orleans, who prepared to see his own vision come to fruition. In 1955, the prince planned to turn Louisiana into his Carthage, where mortals and vampires could finally live in open coexistence. To this end, he intended to breach the Masquerade, and to do so in such a way as it couldn't be covered up. But several weeks before the 250th anniversary of his arrival in Louisiana, Duran was assassinated. He was succeeded in office by Marcel Gill, a spy who claimed the credit for solving his predecessor's murder after he framed the Gangrel Primogen for the crime. We now return to California, which, after a scant 11 years of anarch rule, had descended into a free-for-all. In 1956, Jeremy McNeil was forced to step in once more, this time to establish some sort of order. He called together the leaders of the largest gangs and coteries. They divided LA and California into baronies, hunting grounds of particular gangs or powerful vampires. This did not end the gang wars in the Free States, but it did bring some semblance of stability. In the fall of 1957, the bourgeois anti-tribu of New York got a wild hair in an uncomfortable place. They saw the Camarilla creeping into New Jersey, Baltimore, and Boston, and wanted to launch a crusade against them. But the La Sombra and Zamitzi shot down the plan as it did not come from them. The bourgeois decided that if they could not crack Camarilla skulls, they would settle for cracking La Sombra and Zamitzi skulls. They launched a coup against the New York Sabbat, but when that failed, they resorted to guerrilla warfare in the streets. The Third Sabbat Civil War lasted only 100 nights, but in that time the number of Sabbat Cainites in the New York area dropped from 160 down to 80. The La Sombra and Zamitzi called for a sit-down with their lesser clan brothers before the Camarilla tried to take the city from them. In the end, the Civil War closed with the recognition of the Sabbat Caitiff as a clan in their own right, a move which both sides believed benefited them. Eventually, the Caitiff took the name of Panders, after Joseph Pander, who, ironically, is reputed to have claimed the first La Sombra kill in the Third Civil War. Meanwhile, the Mexican Sabbat had the Anarch Free States under surveillance since they threw the Camarilla out, and decided that it would be a simple matter to snatch Los Angeles out of the Anarchs' hands. On August 11, 1965, as the city burned during the Watts riots, Sabbat war parties rolled into Los Angeles with murder on their minds. The first to fall was Jacqueline Fairmont of Venice Beach, one of the original members of the Revolutionary Council. The rest of the Anarchs scattered for cover to regroup, while Cainites rampaged in the streets. On the third night of the riots, the Anarchs counterattacked, and managed to fight the Sabbat to a standstill. But it was the Sabbat who first noticed the Camarilla archons creeping around the Hollywood Hills, waiting to pounce on the victors. The cardinal in command of the invasion, rather than claim a Pyrrhic victory, withdrew from Los Angeles. The Anarchs, unaware of their Camarilla guardian angels, celebrated their victory over the Sabbat Crusade. Over on the East Coast, Prince Marissa of Washington, D.C. was arguably one of the two most powerful Camarilla princes in the Americas, and after World War II, one of the most powerful in the world, given her single-handed control over the capital of one of the world's two superpowers. The elders of the Camarilla had, for over 4 centuries, considered America to be somewhere over there, a dumping ground for unruly or ambitious fledglings, and a containment zone for the Sabbat and Anarchs. But Prince Marissa had a stranglehold over the city government, Congress, and the civil service that she was unwilling to share with her betters, and so, the Camarilla decided that Marissa needed to be dealt with. Following the death of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968, Washington, D.C. erupted in a 4-day riot, of which several bourgeois Nosferatu took part. Marcus Vattel used the chaos to carry out a coup against Prince Marissa with the secret support of the European Camarilla, ending in her final death in Arlington National Cemetery, and Vattel's ascension to Prince of Washington, D.C. Vattel then blamed the Giovanni for the assassination and called a blood hunt against those responsible for Marissa's death. Vattel went on to rule America's capital with an iron fist, but conceded several areas of national and foreign policy making to his allies and backers, lest he meet the same fate as his lover and predecessor. The events of April 1968 had other ramifications. In Chicago, Prince Loudon had long been plagued by anarchs. Following the establishment of the Anarch Free States and the riots after the death of Martin Luther King Jr., Loudon petitioned the Ventru Justicar for authorization to deal with the anarch problem in his city once and for all. Unwilling to lose more territory to either anarchs or Sabbat, the Justicar gave Loudon her blessing, and Loudon began planning for August, the Democrat National Convention. Near the end of the convention, the Chicago police set on the anarchs and their mortal allies, with Loudon's forces intermingled. Over 100 anarchs disappeared by the end of the convention. Most met final death. The rest fled to Gary, Indiana, St. Louis, Missouri, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or Davenport, Iowa. Despite certain breaches of the Masquerade on Loudon's part, some of which had been caught on camera, Loudon considered the anarchs crushed and his victory secure. And for over a decade, he was correct. A fellow Ventru, who was much less secure in her domain, was Michaela of Manhattan, who, in 1980, declared herself prince. Now there had been princes before, and those claimants died almost nightly, either from internal treachery or Sabbat assassination. But unlike those paper princes, Michaela had enough connections to plead her case directly to the inner circle. Now, Wall Street was one of the few assets in the New World that the European Camarilla considered worth keeping. They approved of Michaela's princedom, and she wasted no time in making use of the right of progeny, essentially mass-embracing fodder to shield her from the Sabbat. An alliance with the Tremere of the Chantry of the Five Boroughs preserved Michaela's throne, and more importantly, her unlife. Yet her domain now suffered from a similar problem as Chicago under Loudon. A full third of Manhattan's Camarilla vampires were sired by Michaela herself. And speaking of Loudon, he had, in the years since his victory over the Anarchs, slightly relaxed his grip on Chicago. He declared a truce with those anarchs who were willing to present themselves to him and pledged to keep his laws. Slowly, the anarchs came out of hiding and grudgingly submitted themselves to Loudon's rule. But then, the caitiff Maldavies appeared, displaying unusual powers for someone of her age and stature, and called for the city's demoralized anarchs to rally to her banner. Secretly, 3 of Chicago's primogenies supported Maldavies' burgeoning revolt as a means to wrest concessions and a larger share of power from Loudon's loosened but still iron grasp. The first major blow to Loudon came on April 15, 1983, when Harold Washington was elected as the first black mayor of the city of Chicago, with a little help from Maldavies. This was the beginning of the Council Wars. Fueled by Menela's potent blood, and with the primogen protecting her, Maldavies was able to remove Loudon's flunkies from key positions in civil government and replace them with her own. Loudon's allies fell while he was unable to locate Maldavies' safe houses and retaliate. Around Christmas of 1985, Loudon launched Operation Incubator. Using his agents in the Chicago police, he launched a campaign of harassment and public humiliation against Maldavies' agents in city government. This backfired as the media reported that the police were persecuting innocent government officials. Somehow, Loden's ability to censor the press had been neutralized. By November of 1987, Loden was so desperate to stop Maldavies that he presented himself to the Primogen and begged for their help. The Primogen, after airing their many grievances against Loden's rule, offered the prince the aid he required in exchange for more say in the rule of the city. Loden agreed and began his counterattack, later referred to as the Thanksgiving Massacre. The first target of his ire was Mayor Washington, who died on November 25th of a sudden heart attack. After capturing and interrogating one of Maldavies' lieutenants, Loden's ghouls and mortal servants hunted down and killed the Anarchs while they slept in their havens. Loden then chased the Anarchs from one haven to the next by night. This relentless pursuit continued until the Anarchs were, once again, chased from the city of Chicago. In 1990, an ancient evil awoke as the Soviet Union collapsed. The Nosferatu Methuselah, Baba Yaga. She saw what had become of her beloved homeland and was greatly displeased. She hunted down and slaughtered the hapless bourgeois of the Revolutionary Council, who had influenced Russia since the October Revolution. Then, Baba Yaga summoned her loyal progeny, as well as corrupt spirits, mages, and even more terrible things, to serve her. Without warning, Russia was cut off to creatures of supernatural power by a mystical barrier that surrounded the entire nation. The Shadow Curtain prevented travel, spying, or even communication by mystical means. In 1993, the city of Chicago was the site of one of the biggest events in Camarilla history. Following Helena's awakening from torpor in 1990 and reinvention of herself as the neonate Portia, a local pack of lupines attacked her haven, the Succubus Club. Prince Loden responded to this unprovoked assault on his domain by declaring a blood hunt on the lupines and their kinfolk. Chicago then descended into chaos as vampires and werewolves slaughtered each other in the streets. By the time the Primogen were able to reach a truce with the lupines, the Tremere Chantry was burned to the ground. Nearly a third of the city's kindred were dead or missing, and Prince Loden was slain, either by lupines or Sabbat assassins. 3 years later, another prince of another major American city was deposed, but this time by a young upstart named Joachim Van Nuys. Van Nuys was one of the East Coast Ventru who traveled west to San Francisco as an envoy. He saw that the city had great wealth and even greater potential, but was ruled by a weak and ineffectual prince in Vannevar Thomas, and with a Primogen that was consumed by infighting and decadence. In 1996, Van Nuys, with the support of his coterie and the quiet blessing of the inner circle, deposed Thomas and his supporters and claimed the title of Prince of San Francisco for himself. Apparently, Vannevar was not in the favor of his clan, because with Prince Joachim came Ventru money, which he used to rule the Bay City with a firm but light touch, ever mindful of the Anarchs nearby and even within his own city. Now, the Anarch Free States had survived invasion from the Sabbat and internal power struggles, but on January 1st, 1998, they were tested by a new enemy they had never knowingly encountered before, the Kuei-jin. Without getting too deep into Wan Kuei politics, the Kuei-jin launched an operation called the Great Leap Outward to claim territory from what they perceived as a soft target. The first battles between the Kuei-jin and the Anarchs were slaughters, as the invaders caught local Anarch gangs and lone vampires by surprise. A few months after the Kuei-jin invasion of America began, in May of 1998, Baba Yaga dispatched one of her generals, Victor, and his Army of the Night to St. Petersburg to locate a scroll that supposedly contained information on the resting place of Absamiliard, the Nosferatu antediluvian. While resting outside of Moscow, 20 vampires of the Army of the Night, including Victor, were dug up by a pack of lupines and exposed to the sun. Later that same month, Baba Yaga, the Iron Hag, met final death, as the mystical shadow curtain that isolated Russia from the rest of the world fell. Her assassin is unknown, but among the Nosferatu, it is believed that her death came at the hands of one of the Niktuku, the fabled monster childer of their clan's antediluvian, tasked to hunt down and slaughter all of his rogue offspring. Continuing the theme of factional disasters, the Tremere anti-tribu, numbering roughly 100, were summoned to Mexico City by Goretrix. Except, it wasn't Goretrix at all, it was Tremere. A decade before, Tremere had lost the battle for his own body with Solid. Tremere's soul then rode the body of his loyal disciple Etrius until he was able to confront and steal the body of his disloyal apprentice, Goretrix, leaving Goretrix trapped inside of a mirror. Tremere then slaughtered the anti-tribu in a great fire. One Cainite claimed to have searched the ruins of House Goretrix and found the word Tezcatlipoca written in blood and ashes. As far as the rest of the Sabbat is concerned, the Tremere anti-tribu destroyed themselves, and good riddance. But other vampires tied the disappearance of the Tremere anti-tribu with a phenomenon that struck the entire Assamite clan. Every member felt a change in their blood. This was the result of the Assamite Methuselah, Shulgi, using the power of the sorcerer caste of the clan combined with his own formidable magic to shatter the Tremere curse. The feared warriors of Hakim were once again free to consume vitae, and many indulged to the point of addiction. But a schism soon followed as Shulgi executed the eldest, Jamal, and began to purge those who would not worship Hakim as a god. Al-Ashrat and Tigirius led the schismatic faction away from Alamut. But this exodus was countered by the Assamite anti-tribu of the Black Hand, who abandoned the Sabbat and returned to Alamut to pledge their loyalty to Shulgi. And to close the book on 1998, the Justicar of Clan Gangrel, Javier de Calais, encountered a creature he believed to be an antediluvian and presented the information to the Inner Circle, only to be rejected, and told the official line that the antediluvians were dead, assuming they ever existed. Javier was outraged and declared that Clan Gangrel were no longer part of the Camarilla. But if Texas v. White has taught us nothing else, it is that unilateral secession is simply not legal. But the Gangrel were never much for following rules anyway, and enough of them respected Javier that they broke ties with the Camarilla and followed him. In early 1999, the Camarilla gave the Sabbat a much-needed reminder of just how the Ivory Tower kicked the Sword of Cain out of most of Europe in the first place. The Battle of New York was a colossal undertaking, a $1 billion project financed almost entirely by Ventru bigwigs, such as Queen Anne Bowsley of London and Fabrizio Ufila of Rome. The plan itself was drawn up by Hardestat's errand boy and problem solver, Jan Pieterszoon. 3 Justicars were called in to lead the military side of the operation: Lucinda, Justicar of Clan Ventru, Cock Robin, Justicar of Clan Nosferatu, and Yaroslav Pacek, Justicar of Clan Bruja. Several Archons were also ordered to take part, including the notorious Theo Bell and the longest-serving Archon, Federico de Padua. The list of the Camarilla's other heavy hitters, freebooters, and ambitious kindred would be too long to memorialize, but by the time things kicked off, the Camarilla had somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 kindred hiding out in the New York area, and surprise was crucial. Pieterszoon, as the brains of the operation, had been tagging the New York Sabbat with radioactive blood, laundered into circulation by the always helpful vice merchants of the followers of Set. Scouts then followed the Sabbat all the way back to their homes from a safe distance, armed with a few Geiger counters. A good chunk of that billion-dollar war chest went to investigative work. Ghouls greased the right palms, and very quietly, police surveillance began on Sabbat havens. Lawyers were hired to do due diligence checks on shell companies and LLCs owned by Sabbat pawns, or even vampires themselves. Even the sanitation workers got a piece of the action if they turned up any suspicious trash collected around Sabbat havens. Eventually, a picture developed. The Giovanni were also well paid to smuggle in the Camarilla forces to New York, and then paid even better to keep their mouths shut about what they were sneaking into the city. Of course, the Camarilla operation didn't get away with it clean. Few Sabbat keep the post of Archbishop by being guileless idiots, and Polonius suspected something was going on, but he had no idea how far up the Camarilla chain it went. So he decided to nip the problem in the bud by the most direct route. In late 1998, he offered to have diplomatic talks with Prince Michaela at her haven. Why she accepted this is a mystery, but Polonius strolled right in, unsheathed his sword, and chopped her head clean from her body. Like I said, the most direct route. Unfortunately, this didn't stem the tide of surprise invasion near the middle of 1999. Michaela's interest in the plan was taken over by one of her childer and the aspiring claimant to the title of prince, Helene Panhard. When the Camarilla had 2/3 of the New York Sabbat identified, the war began. Fabrizio Ufila leaked information about several Sabbat to the Society of Leopold, who dutifully attacked the blood-sucking fiends with their holy hand grenades. Arrest warrants were sworn out against Sabbat ghouls and mortal dupes, who were taken out of circulation by the NYPD. And then, the Camarilla's ghouls just started lighting matches. Quite a few of New York Sabbat woke up at 1 p.m. to find their havens burning down around them. And the fire department were tragically delayed as trucks conveniently had blowouts and engine trouble on routes to said havens. By the time night fell, 20% of the Sabbat in New York had met final death, without a single kindred taking part, or the Sabbat figuring out just what the hell was happening to them. But when the kindred took the stage, things got even worse. 3 kill teams swept through the city to neutralize yet more Sabbat. Cock Robin led a force through the sewers to catch any Sabbat who tried to flee through the tunnels. Theo Bell led vampires in door-kicking and street-fighting operations. And Lucinda's force used helicopters, infrared goggles, and snipers to neutralize Black Hand cells throughout the city. Of course, the police were told to not take calls in certain areas that night, and the next day's news was suspiciously quiet about the previous night's brutal fighting that cut the number of Sabbat down to half. But the Sabbat regrouped in the Bronx, and worse, they got outside help. The Camarilla forces closed in on the Sabbat Warpacks and Templars, but were not only met by Polonia, but by another, the Zamitzi elder, Lambach Ruthven, who had his own reasons to be in New York. The battle very nearly turned against the Camarilla, as Ruthven and Polonia sent over 24 kindred to final death between them, with the Templars and Black Hand performing nearly as well. Yet the sheer weight of numbers carried the fight, and the Sabbat were driven from the city with no more than a dozen Cainites to lick their wounds in Albany and plot their revenge. Calabros, the leader of New York's Nosferatu, was named prince, much to the chagrin of several elders and Michaela's own progeny. But when 3 Justicars and Jan Pieterszoon, who had the inner circle on speed dial, said that was how it was going to be, the argument was over, at least in public. Calabros himself didn't want the job, and declared that he would only be prince for 2 years, just long enough to stabilize the city, and then he was going to return to the sewers. Soon after, on the other side of the world, another war was being waged that had nothing to do with either the Camarilla or the Sabbat. The Indian subcontinent was long the domain of Clan Ravnos, who, despite their reputation in the West as charlatans, vagabonds, and thieves, successfully ruled the Indus Valley from antiquity and had expelled nearly all who challenged them, including the Ashira and the Camarilla. But in the 1990s, they had been sorely pressed by the hell-born creatures they called the Ashura Tizya, or, who called themselves, the Kuei-jin. In desperation, the Ravnos hurled numerous hastily embraced progeny at the Kuei-jin. But one of the quirks of the blood of Cain is that it links every member of a given clan. And the deaths of so many Ravnos in such a short time sent a shockwave through the blood that awakened several powerful Ravnos Methuselahs from torpor, who joined in the fight. But while these Methuselahs turned the tide, several also met final death. By the end of June 1999, enough Ravnos blood had been spilled to shake the antediluvian of the clan from his slumber, Zapatha Shura. The antediluvian cared nothing for the petty wars or invaders. It knew only one thing, that it needed to feed, and it was so ancient that the only thing that could satisfy it was the blood of its own progeny. In a single night, the vampire population of Calcutta disappeared, consumed by the ravenous blood god. As Zapatha Shura journeyed east, the antediluvian filled the minds of psychically sensitive mortals and vampires around the world with visions and terrors. To its progeny who were near, it summoned them so that they could at last fulfill their purpose, to feed their grandsire's seemingly endless appetite. Zapatha Shura made its way towards Bangladesh, where it was confronted by 3 bodhisattvas of the Kuei-jin, while a 4th looked on. This titanic clash of powers slew hundreds of thousands of mortals and drew the eye of the technocracy. The technocracy attempted to intervene in the battle, but none of their forces were sufficient to slay any of the primary combatants, nor to break the cloud cover that obscured the battlefield in near total darkness. Finally, the technocrats deployed tactical nuclear weapons from high orbit, charged with primal energy. The subsequent Holocaust slew and spiritually obliterated every combatant on the battlefield save for one, Zapata Shura. As the battered antediluvian lurched its way towards the last Kuei-jin who was holding the sun at bay, she released her spell. Zapata Shura was exposed to the light of 4 suns, directed by the technocracy's orbital mirrors. Zapata Shura's death scream threatened to crack the earth itself. Then the King of Nightmares fell to the ground as a pile of melted ashes. Apart from those who witnessed the apocalyptic Week of Nightmares, few had any real grasp of what happened, other than any nearby Ravnos who seemed to simultaneously lose their minds. Camarilla scourges and sheriffs took the opportunity to purge the frenzied charlatans in the name of protecting the Masquerade. The surviving Ravnos were regarded as plague dogs and driven from Camarilla territory on pain of final death. The Sabbat were somewhat kinder to their Ravnos anti-tribu packmates. Well, if a stake to the heart can be considered kind. But when the Ravnos came to their senses, the stories they told about being psychically attacked by Zapata Shura in its death throes seemed to reinforce every claim the Sabbat had ever made about the antediluvians and their malevolence. The Camarilla responded by continuing to deny the existence of the antediluvians, all while princes and elders quietly began funding expeditions to locate and destroy the Methuselahs, who the antediluvians would call upon to serve them first. A few more naive elders began constructing impregnable havens and vaults to hide in, hoping, vainly, that the antediluvians' hunger might pass over them. For the Sabbat, the Week of Nightmares simultaneously proved them right and undermined their morale. After all, a few shotguns and bad attitudes would never be enough to stop a blood god who could strike at its grandchildren from the opposite end of the world. Back in California, the Great Leap Outward suffered a reversal of fortunes with the end of the Week of Nightmares. By July of 1999, the Anarch's leaders, Louis Fortier, Salvador Garcia, Crispus Attucks, and Jeremy McNeil, managed to regroup and reorganize their followers. In some battles, the Anarchs were actually getting the better of the Kuei-jin, and progress in the Los Angeles invasion ground down to a stalemate. But the Anarchs also suffered a loss of territory and another blow to their morale when the bourgeois Tara Kearney cast off her allegiance to the Anarchs and declared herself Prince of San Diego, opening her city as a sanctuary and beachhead to the Camarilla. Hao Wei-liang, leader of the foreigner-punishing crusade faction of the Great Leap Outward, was betrayed by his protege, Monkey Trip Wu, who sent false reports to the Blood Court in Hao's name, extolling the unchallenged successes of the Great Leap Outward. A censor of the court discovered that the Kuei-jin campaign in Los Angeles was thoroughly demoralized and making little progress from its earlier victories the previous year. Hao had been shamed, and he cleansed his honor by meeting the sun in October of 1999. This left the Great Leap Outward in the hands of Zheje Li. Li used one of the oldest and simplest strategies of an aspiring invader: divide and conquer. Li sent the Mandarin Fun Toy to the Anarch Salvador Garcia with an offer of assistance against a longtime rival of his, the Anarch faction known as the Crypt Sons. Garcia, despite being one of the strongest proponents for the Anarch movement in the beginning, had grown disgusted with the Anarch Free States, as well as Jeremy McNeil's lackadaisical and, well, anarchist attitude towards the patchwork of gangster feudalism that California had become. The Kuei-jin were very receptive to Garcia's desire for stability and a unified front against the Sabbat. When the Crypt Sons and their mass-embraced fledglings were disposed of, the Kuei-jin offered Garcia a role in their American regime, the New Promise Mandarinate, as Minister of Eastern Los Angeles. Garcia accepted. With one Anarch leader in their camp, with one Anarch leader turned to their cause, the Kuei-jin then moved to Louis Fortier and made him a similar offer to become Minister of Western Los Angeles. Just as Fortier had seen the writing on the wall for the late, unlamented Prince Don Sebastian, he now saw Jeremy McNeil's downfall as tragically inevitable. With two of the Anarch's strongest leaders on the side of the Kuei-jin, Jeremy McNeil, Crispus Attucks, and Marguerite Foucault fled Los Angeles for safety in San Jose. In the year 2000, Madame Gill, Justicar of Clan Toreador, arrived in San Francisco to negotiate with the Kuei-jin on behalf of the Camarilla. Gill's assignment had two purposes. First, her presence was meant as an implied threat to the princes of the western United States. She had an uncanny ability to sniff out traitors and malcontents and deal with them, permanently. The second was that Gill's own loyalty was under suspicion, specifically that she had a long-running romance with a Sabbat Templar. The Inner Circle reasoned that if Gill planned to go rogue, better that she do it far away from them, or if she met final death in glorious battle against the Kuei-jin, even better. One of Gill's archons, Vidal Jarbot, had been tasked to both aid his mistress in the negotiations and send secret reports back to the Inner Circle if he noticed her engaging in any unusual behavior. The negotiations between Zhezhe Li, Fun Toy, Jochen van Nuys, Madame Gill, and Vidal Jarbot lasted for the better part of 2000 until a compromise was reached that was amenable to all sides. Effectively, the Camarilla intended to bribe the Kuei-jin. The new promised mandarinate would keep what it had already taken and would seek no more territory. The Camarilla would pay the new promised mandarinate a sizable sum as compensation for their cost incurred in taking California from the Anarchs, in the amount of $300 million in various financial instruments. With the deal finalized, all that remained was the transfer, scheduled for August 18th, 11:30 p.m. at Coit Tower on Telegraph Hill. But unbeknownst to the Camarilla and the Kuei-jin, they would have two unwelcome guests. Madame Gill's communications had been tapped by the defeated Anarchs of Los Angeles, who planned to attack the meeting, kill every Camarilla and Kuei-jin leader there, and seize San Francisco for themselves. The other was an archon, the Setite Mark Sandhurst, who had been turned to the Sabbat centuries before and recently given a kill order on the Mandarin Fun Toy. As the handover was happening, Sandhurst tried to kill Fun Toy with a flare gun, but missed. Then the Anarchs, led by Jeremy McNeil and Crispus Attucks, hit the scene, and all hell broke loose. What is casually known as the Battle of Telegraph Hill is a bit of a misnomer, as the Camarilla and the Kuei-jin chased the Anarchs through most of downtown San Francisco, across rooftops, in cars, and through alleyways. By morning, the Anarch coup had been routed. McNeil and Attucks were missing, presumed dead, and the Tremere and Toreador Primogen had been assassinated by the Kuei-jin in the chaos. The peace deal was effectively nullified, though the Kuei-jin kept the money. Additionally, the Kuei-jin deported the kindred of San Francisco to approved zones where they could be more easily monitored under the new promised mandarinate. The Camarilla response was to reassign Madame Gill to the southeastern United States. They also replaced Jochen van Nuys as prince, with a fellow Ventru upstart named Sarah Ann Winder, a tactician who had distinguished herself in the Battle of New York. Her appointment was a tacit declaration of war against the Kuei-jin. By the end of the year, the Anarch Free States were effectively dead, as most of its territory had been claimed either by the Kuei-jin or Camarilla, and its leaders slain, missing, or turned traitor. In 2001, the Kuei-jin Ming Zhao arrived in Los Angeles to serve as ancestor of the city. She replaced the treacherous monkey trip Wu. Wu, who had barely survived the rite that crowned him as ancestor, secluded himself to a coastal residence to meditate on his spiritual failings as a Kuei-jin. As in San Francisco, the Camarilla dispatched a wartime prince to Los Angeles to contain and undermine the Kuei-jin's efforts. A former officer in the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte, the ambitious French Ventru, Sebastien Lacroix. The Sabbat sent more war packs up from Mexico to establish a secret presence in the city, led by a Zamitzi elder named Andre. The remaining Anarchs of Los Angeles, stuck between a rock, a hard place, and the open mouth of hell, made a tenuous peace with Lacroix and recognized his authority, along with his freshly minted primogen. In exchange, LaCroix recognized the Anarch barons and their various claims of domain over parts of Los Angeles County. Nines Rodriguez, a lieutenant of the vanished Jeremy McNeil, accepted the Camarilla's amnesty, but still openly flew the banner of the Anarch Free States, with his merry little band of misfits at a dive bar called The Last Round. Later that year, on Halloween night, Regent Melinda Galbraith was assassinated in her own haven in Mexico City by an unknown party. Zachary Sikorsky, the unlucky Zamitzi who discovered her corpse, proceeded to fleshcraft himself and impersonate Galbraith. Why would he do this? Despite being young and new to the blood, he was not stupid. No sane Sabbat would believe for 1 second that a high-generation Cainite like Sikorsky somehow overpowered or surprised someone as powerful and wary as Galbraith, and any number of disciplines that could discern truth would prove his innocence. But in the face of political expediency, innocence is no defense. The Sabbat would need someone to hang for Galbraith's murder, and Sikorsky wasn't important enough in the scheme of things that anyone would seek retribution for his death, which is why Sikorsky maintained the deception and continued to exist as Galbraith in nightly terror that someone would expose him. This brings us at last to October of 2004. A vampire of unknown lineage was unlawfully sired in Los Angeles, but spared from final death by Prince Sebastian LaCroix. The fledgling was quickly caught up in a web of manipulation, betrayal, and murder as the Camarilla, Sabbat, Anarchs, and Kuei-jin vied for dominance over the City of Angels. Tossed into this mix of supernatural intrigue was an ancient artifact, the Ankaran sarcophagus, believed by some vampires to contain the sleeping corpse of a Methuselah, or even an antediluvian. Prince LaCroix and ancestor Ming Zhao conspired to frame the Anarch leader, Nines Rodriguez, for the murder of the Malkavian primogen, Alistair Grout, and used the fledgling as a duped witness to the crime. Following the declaration of a blood hunt on Rodriguez, things get truly fascinating. The warring factions of Los Angeles nearly all suffer from various disasters. The Sabbat's war packs were destroyed, along with their leader, Andre. Then, on Halloween night, the Kuei-jin of Los Angeles were attacked at their headquarters, the Temple of Golden Virtue. The ancestor, Ming Zhao, was sent screaming back to Yomi, and her temple burned to the ground. After midnight, there were also reports of a running gun battle inside a Venture Tower. LaCroix's security forces, his brood of vampires, and his Naglopper sheriff were all subsequently destroyed. Then, the penthouse of Venture Tower exploded, where Prince LaCroix presumably met final death, after all the trouble he went through to acquire the Ankaran sarcophagus and discover its contents. But the chaos and destruction in Los Angeles were just one more scene in the tragic play of the Children of Cain, the Jihad. And how much longer do they have until the curtain rises on the final act, Gehenna? And that was the history of vampires, such as it could be told in under 2 hours. Whew, that was a lot of stuff. Now somebody might yell at me about Bloodlines technically not being canon, but hell, I had fun playing it, so there you go. As for what's coming next, I can't say. I need to go get some inspiration for another series. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and all of the previous ones. I'll be back at some point. Until next time.